So that's really interesting, and I'm minded of when I read your book, you talked about there are 3 different discourses of the good teacher. Do you mean that there are 3 different types of good teacher?
No, that's not what I mean, really. And I should say I've identified 3 discourses which at the time I felt were what I call dominant discourses. There are other discourses, of course. In fact, we may be seeing the emergence of some new dominant discourses now as we speak. By discourse, I refer to, I suppose, a kind of linguistic frame within which we understand something and talk about something and experience something, and in which we're encouraged to think about things in certain ways. In fact, we may almost feel compelled to talk about things or to understand things within certain ways. And if we think about them in different ways, then there's something odd about us. And the discourses which I identified, if we take the first one, it's the discourse of the competent craftsperson, which has become very popular within sort of political, within education policy. The competent craftsperson discourse, it's a discourse because it suggests that there is a certain way of teaching, a certain understanding of teaching and indeed of learning that's the right one, really. This is how we understand teaching, this is how we talk about it, this is how we frame policy about it. And the idea of the competent craftsperson is that basically teaching is about learning and developing certain skills, certain competencies, having certain strategies at your disposal. Forget empathy with students, stop worrying about the social economic backgrounds of students and so on. Just focus on developing these skills. And within that discourse, you could believe that almost anybody could become a teacher as long as they're capable of learning and developing certain competencies. And these competencies have subsequently been translated into standards for teachers. So, you have to develop a competency to a certain level in order to, become a teacher, in order to become another kind of teacher, and so on. So the discourses are really frameworks within which we're encouraged to understand and think about something. And of course, within the framework, there can be many different types of teaching. So within the competence discourse, for example, we might say that there is room for sort of traditional front of class teaching, but there may also be room for a more student-centered teaching, or more progressive, as it's sometimes called. So I think that's the difference, really. They're not types of teaching. They're ways in which we're encouraged to think about teaching, or ways in which people generally understand teaching.
Well, let's come back to this idea of the competent craftsperson, because I think from somebody from outside education, when they look at a teacher, they might think, well, a teacher does certain things.
Yes.
Isn't it possible to just say that a good teacher does this in this particular way, or a good teacher does that something else in a particular way? Are you saying that it's not possible to pin down teaching in that way?
I am, really. I think that teaching is it depends how you define competence, I suppose. If you define competence in terms of, certain fairly technical matters, then perhaps it is possible. But I think most of us in teaching accept that teaching is more than simply being competent in various ways. And as a teacher educator, many times I remember going into a classroom and the poor student, teacher is saying, I've looked at these competencies. I'm doing this, 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 and yet it's just not working. What's going wrong? And I think there's nothing then for them to fall back on. And I think that the competencies can then become very unhelpful for teachers. Apart from producing a very kind of limited idea of what teaching is. The competencies tend to shy away from, sort of things which you might describe as the more affective aspects of classroom practice, for example, and things to do with, feeling, having feelings towards your students, or recognizing and dealing with your own feelings as a teacher. I think you could say that we need to be competent in understanding and managing our own emotionality in the classroom. However, this is not usually something that you would find included in lists of competencies, I think.
So if this particular approach may not be terribly helpful, for instance, for a student teacher or somebody starting teaching, why has it become so popular?
I mean, I think it can be helpful, and I think, you can identify certain things about it. I mean, for example, when I first became a teacher, educator, I think that most universities offering teacher training courses or teacher education courses, such as PGCEs, were doing a good job. They weren't necessarily doing the same job as each other. And it's possible that some were doing, the job better than others. I mean, for example, in some universities, PGC work, frankly, was just given over to subject specialists who perhaps didn't really want to do it, but somebody had to do it. One of the things that the introduction of lists of competencies has done, I think, is to create a certain standardization. And I don't think that's particularly necessarily bad. It's also produced a certain kind of transparency, so that a student teacher can see exactly what they're supposed to do in terms of competencies, and why they're being told they're doing something well or not well. But it's not enough on its own, and I think the problem is that it has become a dominant discourse. And it ties in very neatly with similar kind of discourses related to notions of performativity. Everything has to be measured, but some things aren't easily measured. So the things that aren't easily measured, you either exclude them from the list, or you come up with some way of measuring them which really doesn't work. And I think the popularity is very much linked to a movement generally at the same time. We for example, a movement back towards end of course sit down pen and paper examinations, towards standard attainment tests, towards, certainly in the beginning, a very, very prescriptive national curriculum. So part of a general kind of trend to try and itemize everything, I think. I often describe this in terms of the relationship between questions and answers. There seems to have been a very strong drive towards prioritizing answers, I think. This is the good teacher, that's the answer. Right. I'm going to go into an examination where I have to give an answer. There's only the right answer and the wrong answer. Whereas, you would kind of like us to carry on asking questions, I think. So the idea of becoming is about questioning. It's about asking ourselves and questions. You could imagine you don't have to imagine an education system, really, because it's happening all around the world, not necessarily in England, where the relationship between questions and answers generally, I think, is changing. I think, in education, politicians too are recognising that, yes, the desire for answers drives us forward as human beings. But without questions, there are going to be no answers. And so the importance of asking questions is being recognised a lot more now. And I think this is reflected in national curriculum developments, where a lot of countries are now emphasising, problem solving in small groups, for example. Or so-called flipped learning, whereby students will bring in things which they've learned outside, for example, using the internet, and that will become the basis of the formal lesson in the classroom. So I think things maybe are changing, but I think the competence drive, producing lists of competencies, and then the moving on to the standards. Which is very popular in some countries. It seems particularly in English-speaking countries, for reasons I don't fully understand. I think that's really part of a kind of obsession with the answer. And I would really like to see us going back a little and saying, well, let's focus a bit more on questions.